My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and for 20 years, I've been the woman my husband turned into his favorite joke. You wouldn't believe how a man can carve you down with a smile, how he can make cruelty sound like comedy if the timing is right. Richard had perfected it. At dinner parties, at barbecues, at his office gatherings, even at our own children's birthdays, he had an endless supply of little digs that always seemed to land on me. And the crowd laughed because what else do you do when the host is laughing? You join in, you smile, you pretend it's harmless. For years I pretended too, but every laugh sank into me like a needle, and I carried those needles in silence. That night, though, the night of his 48th birthday, I carried something else, something heavier. In my purse, tucked neatly behind the lip gloss I never wore anymore, and the receipts I always forgot to throw out, sat a folder. Inside was the truth Richard thought I would never find. Numbers, transfers, withdrawals. The proof of where our money had gone. He thought his jokes kept me small, distracted, humiliated. But while he was busy being funny, I had learned to pay attention. The dining room was warm with laughter when Richard raised his glass. He loved attention more than oxygen. His hair had started to gray at the temples, but he still had that cocky posture, the stance of a man who thought the world bent toward him. He tapped his glass, and the sound rang sharp. All eyes turned. "To my beautiful wife," he began, and for a split second, the words almost sounded sincere. Then came the grin, the pause, the inevitable twist of the knife. "The only woman I know who could burn water." Laughter rippled across the table. Some chuckled out of politeness, others more freely. I saw Carol, my best friend, smile tightly, her hand frozen around her fork. She had heard this one before. Everyone had. I smiled too, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. It had become my mask, the only way to survive these moments. But inside, my fingers brushed the folder. Just feeling the edges gave me a strange steadiness. I wasn't here to endure tonight. I was here to end it. Richard basked in the sound of his guests. He always did. He looked younger in those moments, like the years melted away when people laughed with him. He would look around the table pleased with himself, waiting for me to blush or roll my eyes. That was the punchline, my reaction. But tonight I kept my face still, my eyes calm. If he noticed, he didn't care. He moved on, cracking a joke about the food, the wine, even about his own thinning hair, just to prove he could. What no one at that table knew was that for months I had been staying up late combing through our accounts. I'd learned his patterns, the little cash withdrawals at midnight, the hotel charges in the next town over, the flights billed to a business account that didn't exist. I'd followed the trail like breadcrumbs until it spelled a name, Elena Ruiz. Her name wasn't on any joke. Her name wasn't something he bragged about in public. No, she was his secret, his comfort, his reason for draining our savings while mocking me for buying groceries on sale. As the laughter died down, I took a sip of water. The glass trembled just slightly in my hand, not from fear, but anticipation. I glanced at the clock. In less than an hour, she would walk through that door. Because what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she was coming tonight. I had made sure of it. The party had started hours earlier, with Carol helping me arrange flowers and set the table. She had been quiet, too quiet, as she folded napkins and refilled glasses. At the time, I brushed it off as nerves. Carol hated tension. She avoided arguments the way most people avoided fire. But later I would understand her silence in a different way. Now, as Richard launched into another story about the time I supposedly ruined Thanksgiving dinner, when in reality the turkey had burned because he forgot to check the oven, I let my gaze drift across the room. Colleagues from his firm, neighbors from our street, even his parents sat watching him. The golden boy. The charming man who could spin humiliation into entertainment. And me, his prop. But not tonight. Tonight the stage was mine. The clink of glass at my side jolted me. Carol leaned close. "You okay?" she whispered, her eyes flicking toward Richard. I nodded. Never better. She frowned as if she didn't believe me. Richard finished his story with a flourish, spreading his arms wide. The room erupted in another round of polite laughter. He leaned back in his chair, smug and satisfied like a king at his banquet. He had no idea the banquet was his last. The doorbell rang. It wasn't unusual, guests often arrived late, but something about the sound made Richard stiffen. He shot me a quick glance, one I caught before he smoothed it into a smile. The chatter hushed, slightly, anticipation hanging in the air. Carol rose to answer it. I stayed seated, my hand steady on the stem of my glass. When the door opened, the room seemed to exhale all at once. She stood there in a red dress, clutching a small gift bag. Her dark hair was sleek, her smile nervous but hopeful. Elena Ruiz. Younger than me by more than a decade, but not as young as he'd made her out to be. Real. Tangible. Not a whisper on a receipt, not a line in a ledger. Flesh and blood. Richard's face lost its color. The guests stared puzzled, their eyes bouncing between the woman in red and the man at the head of the table. I felt something inside me shift, something that had been coiled tight for years. Relief. Triumph. A strange, almost serene calm. I raised my glass. "Shall we toast?" I said softly, my voice carrying into the stunned silence. And just like that, the room belonged to me. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and for most of my marriage I was silent. I learned how to fold my pain into neat little corners, tuck it behind a smile, hide it beneath polite laughter. It became second nature. Richard's jokes landed like stones, and I swallowed them whole, pretending they didn't bruise. I thought silence was survival, but silence has weight. It stacks up day after day until you feel it pressing down on your chest. I carried it for years, thinking it was better than a fight. Better than the cold shoulder that always came after I dared to challenge him. Better than the way he'd turn my own anger into another joke. "Look at Linda," he'd chuckle, so sensitive, so dramatic. "She can't take a little teasing." The problem with teasing is that it never stopped. It became the rhythm of our life. At barbecues, he'd joke that I couldn't grill to save my life. At office parties, he'd say I looked like his mother in my dress. On vacations, he'd tell people I was terrible with directions. Always small, always cutting, always enough to make me feel like I didn't belong. And I laughed because what else could I do? I had children to raise, bills to pay, a household to run. If I fought, I lost more than my pride. I lost peace. So I stayed quiet. For 20 years I stayed quiet. But the silence changed me. It didn't make me weaker. It made me observant. I learned how to read the tilt of his smile, the twitch in his voice when he lied. I noticed the late nights at the office that didn't add up, the bank balances that slipped lower while our expenses stayed the same. I filed those details away. I learned that silence could also mean patience. The first time I saw the numbers, I thought I'd miscalculated. A transfer here, a withdrawal there, easy to dismiss. Richard said I wasn't good with money anyway. He handled the big things. I was just the wife with the checkbook for groceries. But the numbers wouldn't let me go. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of bills. I'd scroll through online statements, print receipts, highlight lines that didn't make sense. It was like following a trail of crumbs through a dark forest. And at the end of that trail, there was a name, Elena Ruiz. She wasn't just some faceless woman. Her name appeared on transfers, hotel bookings, credit card charges. Money that should have gone to our savings, to our kids' college funds, had gone to her. He hadn't just mocked me, he'd stolen from me. That was the night I stopped being silent. I didn't confront him right away. That would have been satisfying maybe, but short-lived. He was too skilled at spinning stories, too quick with excuses. He would have laughed, smoothed it over, turned me into the paranoid wife who didn't understand how the world worked. No. I wanted more than an argument. I wanted justice. So I kept quiet. But it wasn't the old silence of fear. It was the new silence of strategy. I collected the evidence, built the case. I made copies. I tucked them into a folder, then another. I hid them where he'd never think to look. And then I waited. I waited for the perfect moment. The moment when the world saw him not as the charming man who could make everyone laugh, but as the fraud he really was. That moment came on his birthday. The dining room still hummed with chatter after Elena's arrival. Richard sat stiff at the head of the table, pretending everything was fine, but his eyes betrayed him. He was rattled. He was scared. I sat back in my chair, letting the scene play out. For once I wasn't scrambling to cover his tracks or smooth over his arrogance. For once I was the one holding the secret. Carol leaned over again, her voice low. "Linda, do you know her?" Her eyes were wide, her face pale. I didn't answer. I just gave her a small, steady smile. Because yes, I knew her. I knew every number tied to her name, and I knew this was only the beginning. That night after the guests left, I stood alone in the kitchen, rinsing glasses that still smelled of red wine. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind was alive, sharp, clear. I thought about the years I had wasted laughing at jokes that weren't funny, pretending that his cruelty was just teasing. I thought about the nights I cried in the shower, the mornings I painted on a smile for the kids, the afternoons I hosted his colleagues like nothing was wrong. And I thought about Elena Ruiz, the woman in the red dress. She wasn't my enemy. She was just another player in his game. Another person fooled by his charm, another person used. She didn't know yet what I knew, but she would. Soon everyone would. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and I'll never forget the moment she walked through the door. The party had been humming along like any other of Richard's carefully staged performances. He thrived in rooms like this, glasses, clinking chatter, overlapping, his voice rising just enough to command attention. He was at the head of the table, telling another story at my expense, spinning some tale about how I once burned dinner and nearly set the kitchen on fire. It was a lie, of course. The stove malfunctioned that night, but in Richard's version, it became a comedy routine, another excuse to make me small while everyone else laughed. I forced a smile, the kind that didn't touch my eyes. Inside, my hand stayed steady against the cool stem of my wine glass, because I knew what was coming. The doorbell rang. A hush fell over the room. Guests glanced around confused, everyone was already here. Richard froze mid-sentence, his jaw tightening just enough for me to see it. He smoothed his expression quickly, but I caught it. That flicker of panic. It was like a crack in glass. Small, sharp, but impossible to unsee. Carol stood, always eager to help, and crossed the room to answer the door. I kept my eyes on Richard. His fingers tapped once against the table, a nervous twitch he probably didn't even realize he was doing. And then the door opened. She stepped inside like she belonged there. Elena Ruiz. 32 years old, her dark hair smooth against her shoulders, her lips painted a shade of red that matched the dress hugging her figure. In her hand was a small gift bag, glossy and bright, tied with ribbon. She smiled, uncertain at first, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Richard. That's when the silence hit. It wasn't a dramatic gasp. It was sharper than that. A neighbor set down her wine glass a little too quickly, the clink against the table loud in the stillness. Someone cleared their throat and then thought better of speaking. The laughter evaporated, leaving the air thick with confusion. I watched Richard. His face drained of color, then flushed pink, then pale again. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For a man who always had a comeback, a quick retort, a clever line, he was suddenly mute. And me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Because this wasn't an accident. Elena hadn't just wandered in. She was here because I had made sure she knew about the party. I'd found her email weeks earlier in the trail of receipts and account transfers. I had reached out posing as a friend of Richard's family and casually mentioned the celebration. She thought she was walking into a surprise for him. She had no idea the real surprise was hers. I raised my glass, the movement slow, deliberate. The faint ring of the crystal against my wedding band filled the silence. Heads turned toward me. Even Elena looked at me curiously, as if waiting to see how I would react to her presence. "Shall we toast?" I said, my voice calm, even warm. It wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of line that cuts through noise because it doesn't try. The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was electric. Richard blinked, finally finding his voice. "Linda," he began, his tone strained. I tilted my head, smiling just slightly. "What's wrong, Richard?" "Surprised to see your guest." A murmur rippled around the table. People shifted in their seats. Carol sat down slowly, her face pale. Elena, still holding her gift bag, stepped forward. I thought I was invited," she said softly, her voice breaking the tension like a stone through glass. "Richard told me." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Richard shot up from his chair. "That's enough," he barked, his usual charm slipping into something harsher. "There's been a mistake." But it was too late. The mistake was already out in the open, standing in the middle of his birthday party in a red dress. I stayed seated, calm, as the storm unfolded. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to argue. The evidence was already walking, breathing, speaking for itself. The guests didn't know the details yet. They didn't know about the money transfers, the hotel bills, the savings account drained for dinners and gifts that weren't mine. But they knew enough to see that something was very, very wrong, and I wanted them to see, because for years I had been the one embarrassed in front of them. The one mocked, belittled, turned into a story for Richard's entertainment. Tonight the tables turned. Tonight the embarrassment wasn't mine. Richard turned to me, his eyes wild. "Linda, explain this," he demanded, his voice cracking on the last word. I didn't flinch. I sipped my wine slowly, savoring the taste. Then I set the glass down with care, folding my hands neatly on the table. "Why don't you explain, Richard?" I said softly. "You've always been so good at telling stories." The room went still again. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the punchline. The rest of the evening blurred with whispers and sideways glances. Guests murmured excuses to leave early, though some lingered out of morbid curiosity, unwilling to miss the unfolding drama. Carol sat stiff beside me, her fork untouched, her eyes darting nervously. I didn't ask her why she looked so guilty. That conversation would come later. But Richard, oh, Richard was unraveling. He laughed too loudly at jokes no one made. He poured himself another drink with hands that trembled. He muttered about misunderstandings and crazy women, but each word only dug the hole deeper. And Elena. She stood in the corner, still clutching that ridiculous little bag, her expression shifting from confusion to anger to hurt. She had walked in expecting to be acknowledged, maybe even celebrated. Instead, she was exposed. I should have pitied her. Maybe once I would have. But tonight pity wasn't in me. Tonight was about truth. And truth had finally walked into the room. "My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and I've never seen my husband look so small." The moment Elena walked through the door in her red dress, Richard froze like a deer in headlights. His smile faltered, his hands twitched against the table, and for once in his life, the perfect punchline didn't come. He was silent, and I let the silence stretch. I wanted him to feel it the way I had felt it for years, sharp, humiliating, suffocating. Then he tried to recover. He laughed. Too loud. Too forced. The sound grated against the hush in the room. "Well," he said, his voice cracking, before he smoothed it into that familiar charm, "this is a surprise." He pushed back his chair and stood straightening his shoulders like he could still command the room. "Elena, you must have taken a wrong turn. This is a private gathering." But she didn't leave. She took another step inside, clutching that ridiculous little gift bag, her eyes darting around the table. "You told me to come," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You said tonight—" "Enough." Richard snapped his smile, collapsing into something harder. This isn't the time or the place. The guests shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed. A neighbor coughed into her napkin. Someone refilled their glass just to have something to do. The air was thick with unease. I stayed seated, my hand resting lightly on the stem of my glass. Calm, steady, in control. Richard. I said, my tone soft, almost pleasant. Why don't you explain? His head snapped toward me, eyes wide. He was used to me shrinking, to me smoothing over the cracks in his stories. He wasn't prepared for this. There's nothing to explain, he said, quickly shaking his head. It's just a misunderstanding. She must have misinterpreted. Misinterpreted, I echoed, raising my eyebrows. She showed up here at your birthday party with a gift. That doesn't sound like a misunderstanding. That sounds like an invitation. A ripple of whispers spread around the table. Carol's face turned pale, her eyes fixed on her plate. She didn't say a word. Richard's laugh faltered again. He rubbed the back of his neck, buying time. Look, folks. I don't know what this is, but I promise you it's nothing. Just a mix-up. He tried to move past it, picking up his glass and raising it again, forcing a grin. Now where were we? Let's not let a little confusion ruin the night. To friends, to family. That was when I lifted my fork and tapped it once against my glass. A sharp ringing note cut through the chatter. Heads turned back to me. Even Elena froze. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. To the truth, I said simply. Richard's face drained of color. He lowered his glass slowly, his hand trembling. Elena's lip trembled too. She looked between the two of us, realization dawning. Carol finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda, she said, her hand clutching her napkin so tightly her knuckles whitened. But she didn't say more. She couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was brutal. It pressed down on Richard the way his laughter had pressed down on me for years. For once he was the one squirming in his seat. He tried again, softer this time. Honey, please. Don't make a scene. Not here. I tilted my head, studying him the way he used to study me before delivering another cutting line. You've been making scenes for 20 years, Richard. Maybe it's time someone else got a turn. The guests didn't gasp. They didn't laugh. They sat in stillness, waiting, watching. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Richard, she whispered. What is she talking about? He reached toward her, desperate now. Elena just... But she pulled her arm back, clutching her bag to her chest. You told me... Her voice broke, and with it, Richard's carefully curated mask cracked even wider. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly. I didn't need to raise my voice or spill the folder of evidence hidden in my purse, not yet. The truth was already in the room, standing in red silk, staring at him like he was a stranger. I looked at my guests, at the neighbors and colleagues who had chuckled at his jokes over the years, who had joined in when he turned me into the fool. Their expressions now told a different story. Unease, suspicion, pity for me, and maybe even for themselves, realizing how easily charm could blind them. Richard cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. Linda, this isn't the way. No, Richard, I cut in. This is exactly the way. The weight of my words hung in the air. I could see it in their faces. Every person in that room knew the party had shifted. It wasn't his stage anymore. It was mine. The evening dragged forward in uneasy fragments. Guests picked at food they no longer wanted. Richard poured himself another drink, his hands clumsy now. Elena lingered near the door, trapped between leaving and demanding answers. Carol kept her eyes down, chewing on her lip until it bled. And me. I sat tall, calm, steady. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking, because the cracks had formed. And once glass begins to crack, it never holds. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and I didn't just stumble into the truth about my husband, I hunted it down. Richard thought he was clever. He thought that his cruelty, wrapped in charm and humor, would keep me distracted. For years, he believed his smirks and sarcastic little jokes kept me small enough not to look too closely at what he was doing. And maybe he was right, at least for a while. But one night, when the laughter had died and the house was silent, I sat down with a stack of unopened bills. My kids were grown. The dishwasher hummed in the background, and for the first time in a long time, I had space to think. I started flipping through statements. Numbers don't lie, not the way people do. That was when I saw it. A transfer I didn't recognize. It wasn't large, but it was odd. Money moving from our joint account into a card I'd never used. I made a note of it. At first I assumed it was a mistake banks mess up, right? But then I saw another and another. Always late at night, always just enough to slip under the radar. Richard had always handled the big things, as he called them. He told me to stick to groceries, to small bills, to the little details of the household. He mocked me whenever I asked about our savings, calling me the accountant who couldn't add. His favorite joke was that I'd need a calculator just to count my fingers. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But that night I didn't laugh. I stayed at the kitchen table long after midnight, highlighting numbers, circling withdrawals. My coffee went cold. My eyes blurred, but the pattern was there, steady, deliberate. The next day I checked again. More charges. Hotel bills from the next town over. Restaurant tabs for two. And then the name. Elena Ruiz. I sat there staring at it on the screen like it was a ghost come to life. I had suspected something was wrong for months, but seeing her name tied to our money, it was different. It was real. I printed everything. Every receipt, every statement, every piece of evidence I could gather. I created a folder, then another. I tucked them into places Richard would never look, between the holiday decorations in the attic, inside an old recipe book he'd never touch. I copied files to a flash drive and hid it in a box of sewing supplies I hadn't touched in years. Because if Richard ever found out, I knew if he ever realized I was digging, he would have tried to laugh me off again. Or worse, he'd find a way to spin it to make me the villain. I couldn't give him the chance, so I let him keep mocking me. He told his friends I was terrible with directions while I traced the path of his lies. He teased me for clipping coupons while he emptied our savings to buy Elena jewelry. He laughed at my boring hobbies while I pieced together an investigation more thorough than anything he imagined I was capable of. Every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every joke at my expense became fuel. I had learned to turn humiliation into focus, and the truth was worse than I thought. It wasn't just dinners and gifts. He was siphoning real money, college savings, retirement funds. The safety net we had built together was unraveling, and every thread led back to Elena. I should have felt broken, and for a moment I did. One night, after printing out yet another hotel receipt, I sat at the table and cried. Not because he had cheated, though that cut deep, but because he had stolen the very foundation of our life together. But then the tears dried, and I realized something important. Richard underestimated me. He thought my silence meant weakness. But silence can mean patience, and patience can mean planning. That was when the idea began to form. I wouldn't confront him in private. That was his arena, twisting, mocking, making me doubt myself. I needed an audience the same way he always had. He humiliated me in front of friends, neighbors, family. I would return the favor. So I circled his birthday on the calendar, and I waited. The weeks that followed were torture and liberation rolled into one. Torture because every day I had to smile at him, cook his dinner, fold his laundry, while knowing he was spending our money on her. Liberation because for the first time, I wasn't powerless. I started rehearsing lines in my head. I imagined the look on his face when I laid the truth bare. I thought about the silence in the room when his mask finally slipped. Sometimes late at night, I'd take the folder out of its hiding place, spread the papers across the kitchen table, and just look at them. Proof. Solid, undeniable proof. And then, by sheer luck or fate, Elena handed me the perfect weapon. When I found her email in one of Richard's carelessly saved receipts, I didn't hesitate. I wrote to her carefully pretending to be a friend of Richard's family. I told her about the party, told her it was the night he planned to make an announcement. She believed me. Of course she did. He had probably promised her a dozen times that he'd leave me, that she'd be the one by his side. She thought she was finally being claimed. She thought the gift she carried would mean something. And she came. She walked into that dining room in her red dress, clutching her little bag like it was a symbol of victory. And in that moment, all the evidence I had collected, all the months of silence and strategy, turned into power. I didn't even need to open the folder yet. Just seeing her standing there was enough to make Richard unravel. But I wasn't done, because humiliation was just the beginning. The real truth, the numbers, the money, the betrayal deeper than an affair, was still waiting in that folder. And when the time came, everyone would see it. Everyone. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and I used to believe Carol Matthews was my safest place. Carol and I had been friends since our 20s. We raised our kids side by side, swapped recipes, gossiped over coffee, and leaned on each other through losses and birthdays alike. When Richard mocked me in public, she was always the one squeezing my hand under the table, giving me that look that said, "You don't deserve this." But the night of Richard's birthday, when Elena stood in her red dress at the door, Carol's silence told me something I wasn't ready to face. She knew. Not in the way I knew, with folders of proof and late-night discoveries, but in the quiet, complicit way people know things they choose not to say aloud. I noticed it in her face before she even opened her mouth. Her eyes darted down when Elena stepped inside. Her lips pressed together so tightly the color drained away. She didn't look surprised, she looked exposed, like a secret she'd been holding had suddenly come alive in front of her. And then she didn't meet my eyes. That was the worst part. For 20 years, Carol had always met my eyes, even when no one else did. When Richard told his cruelest jokes, hers were the only eyes that said, "I'm with you. I see you." But that night she stared at her plate, at her napkin, at anything but me. The laughter had died, replaced by awkward whispers and the clink of silverware. Richard was fumbling, Elena was trembling, and I was calm. But Carol was the one who broke my heart. "Linda," she whispered at one point, her voice so low only I could hear. She reached for my arm, her fingers cold. Maybe just let this go for now. Let it go." The words cut deeper than Richard's taunts ever had. He mocked me because he could. But Carol, she had always been the one who swore she'd stand beside me, and in that moment when I needed her most, she wanted me silent. I pulled my arm back gently but firmly. "I've let it go for 20 years, I said softly. "Not anymore." She flinched, her eyes filling with tears, but still she said nothing to anyone else. She didn't challenge Richard. She didn't call out the lie. She sat in silence, chewing on her lip until it bled, complicit in the charade. And I realized something that chilled me more than Elena's arrival, more than Richard's unraveling. Silence can be betrayal too. I thought back to all the times Carol had been busy when I wanted to talk. All the times she'd changed the subject when I hinted at Richard's late nights. The way she'd shrugged when I asked if she'd ever noticed anything strange. Had she known then, or had she chosen not to know, because knowing meant admitting her best friend's marriage was a sham? Maybe she thought she was protecting me. Maybe she thought silence was kindness. But to me, sitting at that table, it felt like betrayal piled on betrayal. I watched her through the rest of the evening, her hands twisting in her lap, her shoulders stiff. She avoided looking at me, avoided looking at Elena. She only looked at Richard, and that was what sealed it. She knew. Later, when most of the guests had slipped out mumbling awkward goodbyes, I found Carol in the kitchen, rinsing plates with shaky hands. The hum of the faucet filled the silence between us. I stood in the doorway, arms folded. "How long?" I asked quietly. Her shoulders tensed. "Linda." "Don't," I snapped, sharper than I meant to, but I didn't care. "How long have you known?" She turned her eyes red, her hands dripping water onto the tile. I didn't know. No, she said weakly. I suspected. I saw things. I heard things. I thought, I thought it wasn't my place. Not your place. My voice broke. I was your best friend, Carol. It was always your place. She flinched like I'd struck her. Tears welled, spilling down her cheeks. I didn't want to hurt you. You hurt me worse by staying silent. I said, my voice low but steady. Do you understand that every joke, every cruel word Richard threw at me, I could survive that? But knowing the one person I trusted most kept the truth from me. That's the cut that bleeds deepest. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. But I didn't reach out. I didn't comfort her. Not this time. Because I had learned something crucial that night. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the silence of friends. Back in the dining room, Richard was pacing like a caged animal, his charm completely stripped away. Elena stood near the door, her arms crossed, her gift bag abandoned on the table. The scene was chaos, whispers, and broken laughter. But in my heart, the betrayal that mattered most wasn't Richard's anymore. I had prepared for his lies. I had proof of his theft, his affair, his manipulation. I had built armor against him. I hadn't built armor against Carol. That was the knife I hadn't seen coming. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and for the first time I didn't have to be the one to speak. Elena did it for me. The room had grown heavy with tension. Guests shifted in their seats, trying to pretend they weren't caught in the middle of a domestic earthquake. Carol sat stiff as a statue, her eyes fixed on her hands. Richard poured himself another drink, his fingers trembling as the liquid sloshed against the rim of his glass. I sat tall, calm, steady, my silence louder than his excuses. And then Elena's voice cut through the air. Richard, she said, her tone sharper than I expected. Not timid, not apologetic. Sharp, defiant. You told me this was the night. You told me I'd finally meet your family and friends. You said I wouldn't have to be a secret anymore. The room froze. Forks paused mid-air. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. I didn't move. My heart thudded in my chest, but my face stayed serene. This was it, the unraveling I'd been waiting for. Richard barked a laugh that sounded more like a cough. Elena, please, he said, voice tight. You've misunderstood. This isn't— Don't you dare! She snapped, her voice rising. Don't you dare act like I'm crazy. Do you think I don't know how much money you've spent on me? Do you think I didn't notice the dinners, the trips, the promises? Gasps rippled around the table. Richard's mask was slipping faster now, his confident grin collapsing into a snarl. Elena, he hissed through clenched teeth. Enough. But she wasn't finished. She dropped the gift bag onto the table with a loud thud. The ribbon slipped loose, revealing a sleek leather watch box. You told me tonight was the night you'd wear this, she said, her voice breaking but still strong. The night you'd finally stop pretending. My eyes flicked to the box. A watch, expensive, gleaming. I didn't need receipts to know it had been bought with our money. The proof I carried in my purse suddenly seemed almost redundant. Elena herself had become evidence. Richard's face was crimson now. He reached for the bag, shoving it aside, his movements jerky. Stop embarrassing yourself, he snapped. She laughed bitterly. Embarrassing myself, Richard? You've been sleeping with me for 3 years. Don't act like I'm some stranger who wandered in here by mistake. The room went silent again. I looked at the faces around me. Neighbors, colleagues, family, all staring in stunned disbelief. Some turned toward me, their eyes wide with pity. Others couldn't look at me at all. But no one looked at Richard the same way anymore. His mask was gone, his charm shattered. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, almost soothing. 3 years, Richard, I asked softly. That's a lot of birthdays to forget. The guests exhaled in unison like the air had been sucked out of the room. Richard slammed his glass onto the table. Enough, he roared, his voice cracked on the word echoing through the dining room. This is my birthday, my house. I won't be ambushed like this. But the damage was done. His rage only made him look smaller, weaker. For years he had used humor to make me the fool. Tonight, anger made him his own punchline. Elena crossed her arms, glaring at him. So what was I, Richard? Just your toy, your secret, your escape. You said you loved me. You said you were leaving her. I didn't flinch. I wanted her words to land. I wanted them to slice through the lies he'd wrapped around us both. He tried to recover his voice, dropping into that old, charming register. Elena, don't do this. Not here. You don't understand. Her laugh was cold. I understand perfectly. You used me, just like you use everyone else. Her words hit me like a strange relief. For so long I had felt like I was the only one humiliated, the only one diminished by Richard's games. But hearing her say it, he used her too, made me realize something. This wasn't just my revenge anymore. It was justice shared. I turned to the table, my voice clear and strong. You've all heard it now, I said. 3 years. While he mocked me, while he drained our accounts, while he pretended to be the charming husband. This is what he was really doing. Whispers spread like wildfire. Guests leaned toward one another, shaking their heads, covering their mouths. Richard's parents sat stiff, their faces ashen. Richard spun toward me, his eyes wide with fury. You set this up, he accused. You invited her. You planned this whole thing. I met his gaze without blinking. You planned this, Richard. The moment you chose to lie, to cheat, to steal from the people who trusted you. I just gave you the stage you love so much. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena looked at me, then her eyes wet but burning. For a moment, I thought she might lash out at me, blame me for her humiliation. But instead, she nodded once, as if acknowledging we were both victims of the same man. She turned back to Richard. We're done, she said simply. Her voice cracked, but the words landed like stone. She grabbed her bag, leaving the watch behind, and walked toward the door. The sound of her heels on the hardwood echoed through the stunned room. The door shut behind her with a final click. Richard stood frozen, his fists clenched, his breath ragged. He looked at me, then at the watch on the table, then back at me. And for the first time in 20 years, I saw fear in his eyes. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and that night in the middle of my husband's birthday party, I finally found my voice. For years I'd been the quiet one, the woman who laughed along when her husband turned her into the punchline, the wife who smiled politely while people chuckled at stories that cut her down, the neighbor who hosted cookouts where everyone laughed with Richard, and no one saw the way my hands shook behind the grill. But when Elena left the room, when the door closed and silence settled over the party like a heavy curtain, something inside me shifted. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Richard was still standing at the head of the table, his fists clenched, his eyes darting from guest to guest, as if searching for someone, anyone who might still be on his side. His face was flushed, his smile gone. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, but he still clung to the illusion of control, waiting for someone to laugh, to smooth it over, to rescue him. No one did. The silence was unbearable, but it wasn't my silence anymore. It was his. I pushed back my chair slowly, the scrape of wood against the floor echoing in the stillness. All eyes turned to me. My knees trembled, but I stood tall. Some of you have been to this house a dozen times. I began, my voice low but clear. You've sat at this table, eaten my food, laughed at Richard's jokes. You've heard the stories about the dinners I ruined, the mistakes I made, the ways I embarrassed him. A ripple of discomfort spread across the guests. A few shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. But I pressed on. I laughed too, Because what else could I do if I argued I was called sensitive? If I stayed quiet, I was a bore. So I smiled. I played along. I let him turn me into his little comedy routine. My eyes swept the table. And you laughed with him. All of you. Faces turned away. Some flushed red. Others stared at the tablecloth. The weight of shame rippled through the room, but I wasn't cruel. I wasn't blaming them the way he had blamed me. I was telling the truth. I want you to understand something, I continued. For 20 years I have lived like this. Every joke, every dig, every little story chipped away at me. He made me small so he could look big, and you helped him. Richard slammed his fist on the table. Enough, Linda, he barked. You're humiliating yourself. I turned to him slowly, my voice steady. No, Richard. You've been humiliating me for decades. Tonight, I'm done playing the fool. The room went dead silent again. I took a breath, feeling the words pour out of me, unstoppable now. Do you know what silence does? It eats you alive. It makes you doubt yourself, question your worth, wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe you are the fool. I lived like that for years. I cried in the shower so no one would hear me. I smiled at my children so they wouldn't see the truth. I sat at this table and swallowed my pride until I thought I'd choke on it. My hands gripped the back of my chair, steadying me. But silence also teaches you something. It teaches you to listen, to watch, to notice the things you're not supposed to notice. I let the pause hang. Richard shifted uneasily. That's how I found out, I said softly. That's how I learned about Elena. About the hotels, the dinners, the gifts. About the money that vanished from our savings, our children's future, to pay for his lies. Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's mother covered her mouth with her hand. A colleague muttered something under his breath. Richard shook his head violently. She's lying. She's making this up. I smiled, calm, cold, certain. I have the receipts, Richard. Every withdrawal, every bill, every transfer. I've been collecting them for months. He froze, his mouth open but empty. For once he had no words. I straightened my shoulders, my voice rising just enough to fill the room. You wanted me small. You wanted me humiliated. You wanted me to stay quiet. But tonight, in front of everyone you tried to impress, I'm telling the truth. You are a liar. You are a thief. And you are no longer my husband. The words fell heavy, final, irreversible. Guests stared at me in stunned silence. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. This wasn't weakness, it was release. 20 years of swallowed pain finally finding air. Richard stumbled, reaching for his glass again, but his hands shook too badly. He dropped it, and the shatter rang out like a bell. Red wine spread across the tablecloth, seeping into the fabric like blood. No one laughed. No one clapped him on the back. No one saved him. The silence was mine now. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. My body trembled, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in years. For once, the room wasn't laughing at me. For once, I wasn't the punchline. I was the truth. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and I thought betrayal could only come from the man who mocked me. But that night, I learned betrayal wears many faces, and sometimes it wears the face of a friend. After my speech, the room sat stunned. Richard had slumped into his chair, wine dripping from the broken glass into the tablecloth. His face was pale, his eyes wide like a magician caught with no tricks left. No one laughed, no one clapped. Even his colleagues, the men who always slapped his back and chuckled at his jokes, sat stiff and silent. The silence was mine now. But in that silence I heard something else. A tiny sound, wet, shaky, almost hidden. I turned my head. Carol was crying. She sat 2 chairs down, her shoulders trembling, her napkin crumpled in her hands. Her tears weren't the clean, shocked tears of someone blindsided by a revelation. No, hers were the guilty kind, the kind that spilled from a person who had carried a secret for too long. Our eyes met, and she looked away. The pain in my chest was sudden, sharp, deeper than the humiliation Richard had inflicted all these years. Because I understood. I saw it in her face. She knew. She'd known. I rose from my chair, the room holding its breath. I walked around the table slowly, each step deliberate. When I stopped behind her, she stiffened. "Carol," I said softly, "how long?" Her shoulders hunched. She shook her head quickly as if denying it would erase what I'd already seen in her eyes. "Linda, please don't lie to me." I cut in, my voice firm, not raised but sharp enough to make her flinch. "How long have you known?" Her lip trembled. She turned her face toward me, eyes red and swollen. "I didn't know for sure," she whispered. I suspected. I saw them once. At the cafe near the highway. I thought maybe it was innocent. But then... But then what?" My voice cracked. Her tears fell harder now. "Then I saw them again. And again. I told myself it wasn't my place to say anything. I thought I was protecting you. I thought... Protecting me?" I snapped, my voice finally rising. The guests shifted uncomfortably, but I didn't care. The words burned inside me and I let them out. "You sat in my kitchen, Carol. You held my hand while I cried, and you never said a word. You let me doubt myself. Let me think I was crazy. Let me be humiliated in front of all these people while you knew the truth." She shook her head violently. "I was scared. I didn't want to lose our friendship. I didn't know how to tell you without breaking your heart." "My heart broke anyway," I said coldly. "The difference is, you were supposed to stand beside me. And instead, you stood in silence." The words landed heavier than I expected. Carol sobbed openly now, pressing her napkin to her face. No one at the table moved to comfort her. No one moved at all. They just watched as the truth spread like fire. I turned away from her slowly, my chest tight. I had prepared myself for Richard's betrayal. I had armored myself against Elena's arrival. But this cut deeper than any affair. Because Richard had mocked me for years, but Carol had abandoned me in silence. Later, after most of the guests had scattered, I found her in the kitchen again. The faucet was running, dishes stacked haphazardly in the sink. She was scrubbing a plate with trembling hands, tears still streaking her cheeks. I leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "Why?" She froze. The plate slipped, clattering into the sink. "I thought if I told you," she whispered, "you'd hate me for not telling you sooner. I thought maybe he'd stop. Maybe it wasn't serious. Maybe I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," I said flatly. "And you didn't protect me. You protected him. By saying nothing, you gave him cover. You gave him more time to laugh at me, to lie to me, to spend our money on her." Her chin quivered. "I didn't mean to hurt you. You hurt me worse than he ever did," I said. My voice cracked, and I hated that it cracked, but I let it stand. Because I expected it from him. But I expected better from you. She broke down completely, then sobbing into her hands. But I didn't reach out. I didn't comfort her. Not this time. Because forgiveness might come someday, but not tonight. Tonight, the truth mattered more than comfort. Back in the dining room, Richard was still sulking in his chair, muttering to himself, trying to salvage scraps of dignity from the wreckage. But his downfall felt almost small compared to the wound I carried now. Betrayal isn't just what someone does to you. Sometimes it's what someone doesn't do. The silence, the complicity, the refusal to stand beside you when you need them most. Richard had mocked me. Elena had betrayed me. But Carol had abandoned me. And in some ways, that was the cruelest cut of all. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and until that night most people thought my story was only about infidelity. But adultery was just the surface. The deeper betrayal was money our family's security siphoned away piece by piece. And when the truth came out, it wasn't from me. It came from someone else in the room. His name was Thomas Blake. To most of the guests, he was just another neighbor, a quiet man who lived 2 streets over, known mostly for his garden and his golden retriever. But to me, Thomas was more than that. He was a lawyer, a sharp one, the kind of man who noticed details others overlooked. When I started my quiet investigation months earlier, I had asked him a casual question over coffee one morning. Something simple about joint accounts, about spousal rights. He had answered carefully, his brow furrowing as if he sensed more than I was saying. He didn't pry. But that night at Richard's party, as the drama unfolded, I saw his sharp eyes watching closely. He waited until after my speech, after Elena stormed out, after Carol's guilty silence had filled the room with a different kind of betrayal. Then he cleared his throat. The sound cut clean through the whispers. "Linda," he said, his voice calm but firm. "May I see the receipts you mentioned?" The room shifted. All eyes turned to me. I hesitated only a moment before reaching for my purse. The folder had been there all night, heavy as a stone. My hand didn't shake as I set it on the table and slid it toward him. Richard lunged forward. "Absolutely not!" He barked, his hand slapping down on the folder. "This is private." But Thomas didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow. "Richard, when you steal from a joint marital account, it isn't private anymore." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's face went crimson. "I didn't steal anything," he sputtered. "It's my money." "Our money," I corrected softly, my voice cutting sharper than his shout. "And you spent it on her." Thomas calmly pulled the folder from under Richard's hand and began flipping through the pages. He studied each printout, each highlighted withdrawal, each bill. The room was so quiet I could hear the paper shifting. Finally, he looked up. His voice was measured, professional, but it carried weight. "These transfers aren't just questionable," he said. "They're illegal. Draining joint funds without disclosure, moving money into hidden accounts, using family savings for personal gain. If Linda wanted, she could press charges." The words landed like a hammer. Richard's jaw dropped. "Charges?" Thomas nodded. "Financial misconduct, marital theft, possibly even fraud depending on the accounts. This isn't just an affair, Richard. This is criminal." The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't awkward. It was damning. I looked at Richard, then really looked at him. For years he had been the man with the clever lines, the smirking face, the endless jokes. Now he looked like a cornered animal, his hands trembling, his eyes darting desperately around the room for someone to save him. No one moved. He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked in his throat. "Come on, Tom, you're exaggerating. This is between me and my wife. We'll work it out privately." But Thomas shook his head. "Not anymore. You turned your marriage into a stage, Richard. Tonight you got your audience, and they deserve to know the truth." The weight of those words pressed on everyone. I saw Richard's parents' faces fall. His colleagues avoided eye contact. Even Carol couldn't meet his gaze. I spoke then, my voice quiet but steady. "For 20 years you mocked me. You made me the fool. But I wasn't the fool, Richard. I was watching. And I have every number, every receipt, every proof of what you did." Richard's face twisted, desperation creeping in. "You can't do this, Linda. You'll ruin me." I let out a long breath. "You ruined yourself." The room seemed to lean away from him after that. No one defended him. No one softened the blow. Even his laughter, once the glue that held every gathering together, was gone. And then I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for dignity anymore. I was fighting for survival. For my children's future. For every dollar he had stolen under the guise of jokes and charm. The betrayal wasn't only personal, it was financial. And now it was undeniable. I turned to Thomas. "What happens next?" He glanced at Richard, then back at me. "That depends on what you want, Linda. But you're in a strong position. Very strong." I nodded slowly. The decision wasn't final yet, not in that moment. But the path was clear. The evidence was out. Richard's charm was gone. His lies had collapsed, and for the first time the law was on my side. I looked at my husband, no, the man who used to be my husband, and I didn't see strength anymore. I didn't see wit or power. I saw fear, and fear looked good on him. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and that night I ended my marriage in front of everyone who had ever laughed at his jokes. The air in the dining room felt charged heavy like a thunderstorm just before lightning strikes. Richard sat slumped in his chair, his face pale, his fists clenched. The folder lay on the table between us. No longer a secret, no longer mine alone. Thomas had already said the words that turned whispers into undeniable truth, fraud, theft charges. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Because Richard had humiliated me for years in front of audiences like this. His colleagues, our neighbors, his family, they had laughed with him while I sat silent. Tonight, I needed them to see the truth with their own eyes. The microphone for his toast still sat on the sideboard. I rose from my chair and walked toward it slowly. My heels clicked against the hardwood, each step deliberate, steady. Every head turned to watch me. Richard's voice cracked. "Linda, sit down." "Don't you dare!" I picked up the microphone. The faint hum filled the silence. I lifted it to my lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice clear, steady. "For years you've heard my husband's stories. You've laughed at his jokes. You've joined in while he made me the fool. But tonight I'm telling the story." The room was still. Even the guests who had been inching toward the door froze in place. I placed the folder on the table beside me and opened it. Pages of receipts, highlighted statements, transfers, hotel bills, all of it lay spread out like a deck of cards. "This," I said, holding up the first page, "is a hotel bill. Paid with our joint account. He wasn't there on business. He wasn't there with friends. He was there with Elena Ruiz." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard's face flushed deep red. "This," I continued, lifting another page, "is a string of transfers. Small amounts made late at night. Enough to avoid suspicion but steady enough to drain thousands from our savings. Money meant for our children's future." I flipped to another page. "And this is jewelry. Not for me, not for our family. For her. All of it stolen from us, hidden behind his laughter." Gasps filled the room. I saw Richard's parents' faces collapse, his mother shaking her head in disbelief, his father staring at the table like the truth had knocked the wind out of him. His colleagues avoided his eyes. Even Carol, her face streaked with tears, could no longer pretend ignorance. Richard leapt to his feet, his voice shaking. "Stop this. You're embarrassing yourself." I turned the microphone toward him. My voice was calm. "No, Richard. You embarrassed yourself. I'm just telling the truth." He slammed his hand on the table. The wine glasses rattled. "This is my house. You can't do this." I held his gaze, my voice cutting sharp. "This was our house, and you lost it the moment you turned our marriage into a lie." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's shoulders slumped, his face twisted in desperation. I took a deep breath. My chest ached with the weight of it, but my words came steady, unshakable. "Richard Harper, I am done. Done being your joke, your fool, your victim. This marriage ends tonight. In front of every person who ever laughed at me, I'm saying it out loud. We are finished." The words hung in the air like a final bell, irreversible, unforgiving. Gasps broke the silence. Someone whispered, "She really did it." Others nodded wide-eyed. Richard staggered back like the words themselves had struck him. He reached for the watch Elena had left on the table, clutching it like a lifeline. His hands trembled. "Linda, please don't do this. We can fix it. We can." But the words rang hollow, pathetic. He wasn't the charming man anymore. He was a liar, a thief, a fool stripped bare. I lowered the microphone, my hands steady now. "I already did," I said simply. The room stayed frozen in stunned silence. Then slowly people began to move. Chairs scraped against the floor. Glasses clinked. Guests gathered their things, avoiding Richard's eyes, some patting my arm on their way out, whispering, "Good for you." Richard stood alone, clutching the abandoned gift like it could anchor him. No one laughed. No one applauded. He had no audience left. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and that night my husband's stage collapsed under him. For years, Richard lived for the crowd. He thrived on their laughter, fed on their applause, measured his worth by the chuckles he could wring from a room. And I was always his prop, the target of his jokes, the fool in his stories. But when I declared our marriage over in front of everyone, the room that once roared with laughter turned to stone. No one laughed. No one clapped him on the back. No one saved him. He stood there clutching the abandoned watch Elena had left, his knuckles white, his face twisted, his mouth opened and closed like a man drowning, searching for air that wasn't there. Finally, he tried. "Come on, everyone," he said, forcing a chuckle that died before it left his throat. "You all know Linda, she's dramatic. Always has been. This is just—" His voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "This is just a little fight. We'll laugh about it tomorrow." But no one laughed. The silence pressed in heavier than any sound. Guests stared at him with blank faces, their eyes sharp with judgment, pity, even disgust. Richard's colleague, the one who had always laughed the loudest at his jokes, shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." He stood gathering his coat. His wife followed. Others followed too. Chairs scraped, glasses clinked as people set them down. Murmurs filled the air. One by one, the audience Richard had spent years cultivating slipped away. "No, wait," Richard stammered, his voice rising in panic. "Don't leave. This is all just a mistake. You know me. You know I'd never—" But they didn't believe him anymore. Because charm only works when there's trust, and his trust was gone. I sat at the table, calm now, my hands folded neatly in my lap. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt steady. Richard stumbled toward me, dropping the watch onto the floor with a clatter. "Linda, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Don't do this. We can fix it. We can—" His hands reached for mine, desperate, shaking. I pulled them back. "It's already done." The words hit him like a slap. His knees buckled, and he sank into the chair across from me. His eyes were wet, his face contorted with desperation. But I felt nothing for him. Not pity, not anger, just emptiness. Because the man in front of me wasn't my husband anymore. He was just a liar who had lost his mask. Behind us, the last few guests lingered, whispering as they slipped out. Even his parents left quietly, his mother's face streaked with tears, his father's hand heavy on her shoulder. When the door shut behind them, the silence was deafening. For once, Richard had the silence he had given me for years, and it crushed him. He tried one last time, his voice hoarse. "Linda, I was just having fun. The jokes, the money, it didn't mean anything. You're my wife. You're supposed to stand by me." I stood slowly, gathering the folder from the table. My heels clicked against the floor as I walked past him. I paused in the doorway, turning just enough to meet his eyes one last time. "I stood by you for 20 years, I said softly. "And all you gave me was humiliation. Now you can stand alone." His face crumpled, but I didn't wait to see more. I walked out of the room, out of the noise, out of the life he had built on my back. And behind me, I heard it, the sound of his sobs breaking through the silence. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 46 years old, and the morning after I ended my marriage, I woke up lighter than I had in 2 decades. The house was quiet. No laughter echoing down the hall. No mocking voice filling the kitchen. No stage waiting for me to step onto as his unwilling fool. Just silence. But this silence wasn't crushing. It wasn't the heavy blanket of shame I'd carried for years. This silence was clean. Clear. Mine. I padded into the kitchen barefoot, the floor cool beneath my feet. The morning sun spilled through the windows, painting everything gold. I brewed a pot of coffee, and for once I didn't feel the urge to gulp it down quickly before facing Richard's ridicule. I sat at the table, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and let myself breathe. For 20 years I'd lived inside his jokes. Now I was writing my own story. Chaptis. The night before replayed in fragments. Elena's red dress glinting in the light, Carol's tear-streaked face, Thomas's calm voice confirming the theft, the guests scattering whispers clinging to them as they left, and Richard crumpled in his chair, sobbing into his hands as I walked away. It wasn't triumph I felt remembering it. It was release. He had taken so much from me. My dignity, my voice, our savings. But he hadn't taken my will. And last night I proved it. I had given him back his stage, but stripped of the audience, stripped of his mask. He wasn't a star anymore. He was just a man, small and broken, finally facing himself. I spent the morning making plans. Not wild ones. Not desperate ones. Calm, deliberate plans. The folder sat on the counter, its papers neatly stacked. My proof. My weapon. My shield. I would take it to Thomas, and together we would start the process. Divorce. Financial recovery. Legal consequences if necessary. The thought didn't scare me anymore. It steadied me. I called my daughter first. She was 22, living in the city, and when she answered, her voice was groggy. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said softly. "Everything's finally right. Your father and it's over. I'll explain when you come home. But I want you to know, this wasn't about you or your brother. It was about me. About finally standing up." There was a pause. Then her voice cracked with emotion. "Mom, I'm proud of you." Tears filled my eyes, but this time they weren't heavy. They were light, cleansing. "Thank you, sweetheart." That's all I needed to hear. Around noon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under my feet. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Whispers had already spread. The story was out. But for the first time, I didn't shrink under their eyes. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. I wasn't the fool anymore. One woman, Mrs. Grant from across the street, stepped out onto her porch as I passed. "Linda," she called softly. I turned and she gave me a sad smile. "You were brave." I nodded once. I was overdue. She nodded back, and that was enough. That evening I sat on the porch with a glass of wine. The house was quiet behind me, but I didn't feel alone. The crickets chirped, the sky blushed pink with sunset, and for the first time in years, I felt at home in my own skin. Richard would fight, I knew. He would rage, deny, plead, maybe even try to charm his way back. But none of that mattered. The truth was out. His stage was gone. And I wasn't his prop anymore. I thought of Elena walking out in her red dress, heels clicking against the hardwood. I thought of Carol sobbing into her hands, realizing silence is a kind of betrayal. I thought of Thomas calmly saying the words that turned suspicion into proof. And I thought of myself standing tall, microphone in hand, telling the story out loud for the first time. That image would stay with me forever. Because in that moment, I wasn't the woman mocked at dinner parties. I wasn't the wife who swallowed her tears in silence. I was Linda Harper, 46 years old, and I was free. People often think revenge is about destruction. But for me, it wasn't about tearing him down. It was about reclaiming myself, about ending the cycle of laughter at my expense, about showing my children, my friends, my community, and myself that dignity isn't something you beg for, it's something you demand. Richard's downfall was just the byproduct. My freedom was the goal, and I had it now. When I went to bed that night, the silence filled the house again. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness. For the first time in 20 years, the silence didn't feel like a prison. It felt like peace.